Hey guys, Nick here, and welcome to the omniverse of Nick and the single part What If John Wick Was in the MCU? Now, before we get into today's video, be sure to smash the like button, subscribe to the omniverse, and further acknowledge and support the future of the omniverse by checking out the Discord, Patreon, and Google Doc on the homepage, as well as commenting or requesting future expectations and what ifs for the future. Without further ado, let's get into this single part. Now, this is going to be a one-parter, and I know I plan to already put John Wick again in The Walking Dead with Daniel Salazar after doing the analysis video of him, which has gotten quite a bit of success, but I plan to redo the John and Daniel story because of it gotten lost on my other laptop, etc., etc. But now we touch upon him in the Marvel Universe. But, as you guys probably have noticed, it's going to be a one-parter, and it's going to be a different kind of analysis. Yes, I know, all of them are different analysis videos, but this one will be sort of interesting. This analysis is interesting because we are going to do with John Wick what we don't usually kind of do, and this would be the first for someone crossing into the MCU. And then with Batman, I'm going to do something completely different. He'll actually fit in many ways to the MCU because he's a completely different character, although he is still superhuman like John Wick. But that's for another time. We are going to look at all of the MCU films up to this point and see which ones best fit the likes of John Wick. Which ones he would fit in and how he would fare. So, even though I'm going to show this and talk about it at the very end, we're not going to be making this a multiple parter. I was planning on it, and I even worked on it at a past point, just like What If Shane Killed Rick the remake and several other things that I dropped and then decided to redo. Yeah, this was one of them. But I'll explain at the very end. For now, let's just dive into what if John Wick was in the MCU and touch upon all the films that he would be the most influential in. First, Marvel's Avengers would be the centerpiece film of it all that would put him in. Now, let's just say this takes place either A, right before John Wick 1 takes place, or right after John Wick 4 and John Wick somehow survives it. One of the two. The former, I feel, is more logical. John would be introduced in Marvel's Avengers, and the only thing besides small talking and stuff like that, and small little changed moments that I think he would factor the most in, is when Hawkeye storms the ship and is originally going to have his fight with Black Widow. But this time, it's John Wick versus Hawkeye. And even though Hawkeye has different kind of bows and everything like that, I feel that these two, John Wick would hold the edge over him way, 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 way more than Black Widow. Sure, Hawkeye had sort of a soft spot for her, and that sort of maybe messed with the mind control, but with nothing like that, you'd think that Hawkeye would take this fight, especially with different kind of bows that Hawkeye or John Wick couldn't be prepared for. And it's very true. In many cases, Hawkeye would win this fight. But if they're talking about like peak John Wick, then he almost completely takes this fight 9 out of 10. But if we're being for real here, being off guard with a bowman, which is definitely something I feel that John Wick would have never encountered, because we only saw people with like knives and swords and guns and machetes and stuff like that, but we never saw anyone fight John Wick with a bow. So, well, that rhymed, by the way. we could think that this would help Hawkeye win this fight. But even if John Wick had trouble, or Hawkeye was about to get killed by John, I feel that Black Widow would intervene. So no, I don't think that Hawkeye would die here. Then we get to all the Avengers assembling and getting ready to fight the Chitauri and Loki. That's where John would come into play and help everybody. You know, Black Widow with the gun, Hawkeye with the bow. John Wick would just have his whole freaking arsenal of weapons. So he'd be pretty loaded up. He'd be like the more human, like, assassin-like type of Iron Man, which I was going to do in the story version of this, but John Wick with the Iron Man suit just felt way too silly. That's another reason why the story version was dropped. It's because I really did not think that through. So, in the end, they would all win. Kind of easier with John there, for the most part. Just a small heads up. And he would be, at the end of the film, cornering Loki and forcing him to surrender. Next movie would be Captain America the Winter Soldier. Now, he wouldn't show up until Cap and Black Widow, or Natasha, if you really want to be specific, would just be beginning to figure out about the Winter Soldier, aka Bucky Barnes, which would be right before their fight over the bridge and in the streets and everything. Whenever Cap figures out that he's Bucky and everything, it would be just before that. So, yeah. John factors in here, and he fights Bucky pretty much alongside, if not without, Captain. And he's actually able to put him down a lot faster, yet this is pretty tough. The Winter Soldier's actually pretty freaking strong, but John Wick is merciless. True, Bucky and his mind control wasn't exactly, pitiful either. But with John Wick versus Bucky, this would almost be a completely even battle. Yes, it's kind of like, John Wick versus Hawkeye, but the only difference there is Hawkeye has the field advantage with different kinds of bows, whereas Bucky just has guns in his metal arm and super combat. But with John, this is almost like Cap versus Bucky, all the fights that they had, except John is like, T'Challa or Black Panther in that one fight of theirs in the building whenever Bucky breaks out. Yeah, it's kind of like that, except John is the T'Challa of that, except a little bit more like, tougher, because, it's John Wick. Anyways, Bucky is unmasked, and Cap and Natasha, I feel, would take the story from there, with John Wick being like the help. Then, The Age of Ultron would be his next film. He would factor in whenever Iron Man, Thor, and Cap are in the building about to fight Ultron, and that's when Scarlet Witch takes control of everybody right before Hulk rampages the city, Hulkbuster, yada yada yada. So that's really the best that he does besides fighting the Ultron bots. That's about it. And then Civil War. I feel that with honestly everything going on in the story, to factor John Wick into this movie would be hard, considering who he is. But I feel with Cap and Bucky and everybody like that, why would he turn to Iron Man's side to give up being who he is? True. Very true. He wanted to retire. He wanted his wife. He wanted his dog. He wants to keep retiring, but in the movies, he was never allowed. So, granted, he could easily be factored into Iron Man's side. But whenever he truly had to, at the end of the second film, remember, he said, "Let them all come, I'll kill them all." Remember? So, with everything that has happened in the story, I feel that John would honestly find it within his best interest to keep up his assassin persona, be it the fact that more threats could mean his help is needed. And I feel that John Wick would have honestly grown a bond with the Avengers at this point, even if it took him a long time. More than his assassin program, that's why it would make more sense if it was like maybe retired John Wick at the end of John Wick 4 and he survives it all. So he wouldn't have had as much on his plate about honoring the marker and stuff like that, because that could have gotten in the way of the story. But here, I feel that it would be in his best interest to join Cap, be it keeping his assassin persona, being with the Avengers still, keeping his freedom, quote unquote, not being in prison, and, the list goes on and on. And then he would probably maybe help Cap and Bucky with Iron Man, and would honestly be really cool to see John Wick, Bucky, and Cap versus Iron Man. And Cap and Bucky lasted to the very end, and Cap beat him. So with John Wick, that fight would have been almost a complete cakewalk against Iron Man. And would have forced Iron Man to probably get even more serious, at least against Cap and John Wick, because he was already freaking keen on killing Bucky in the original. But even if he weren't, and he was stuck back with the others, then Cap and Bucky would have just gone on against Iron Man in the end. And then the last two films I feel that he would have any factor in is Infinity War and Endgame, where we would see the memes arise with John Wick versus Thanos. And that's the perfect place to end this analysis. So, initially, I had planned to make this a series back whenever I had it all ready. And this was one of the stories, by the way, like the What If Shane Killed Rick remake, that I originally had, but then marked for a future date because I couldn't figure out how to make it work. And that's just it. This one can't work as a series. And with The Walking Dead, besides the now going to be remade version of John and Daniel, even though I made an analysis there, reason that I stuck so hard to making John and Daniel a pair, making that a story, is because John is way too overpowered for The Walking Dead. But the thing with Marvel is, yeah, don't get me wrong, I stand by my decision that he is much more an MCU character than a Walking Dead character, but the thing is, he's only on par with Captain before the Hammer, Black Widow, Hawkeye, Bucky, and pretty much anyone who doesn't exceed Iron Man's gadgets, weapons, and literal stuff that could kill John Wick in a single shot. So, honestly, I feel like his rules here, John Wick versus Bucky and everything, was pretty good. Now, even though it was a simple analysis, I did tease that this was going to be a one-parter alongside the next two stories before the Merle, Gargiulo, and Frieza turning good. But I hope, along with this, you have enjoyed the two analysis videos that I've done with John Wick, both in Walking Dead and in Marvel. Now, that doesn't mean that future crossover stuff involving John Wick will always be one part. I don't know that yet. But, unfortunately, besides the John and Daniel story getting remade, possibly into its full entirety, which would be kind of lame, but honestly, I still want to bring it back, this is what you guys will be getting for now. So, hope you guys enjoyed this spin on John Wick in another franchise. And the next few stories are The King, and then JFK not getting assassinated, and then on to the next list, which will feature the two main stories, What If Murrow Spared Gargiulo, and Frieza Turning Good, which is already done. After that, the next episode, the third one to the McQueen Walking Dead verse, and I'm taking a break, finally. So, with all that said, hope you guys enjoyed here, and I will see you in the next story.